Very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICAN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So we will start the day with the prelims theme of the day. Today we will consider the environment topic of wetlands. So in this you're supposed to write about the Ramsar wetlands, especially the ones that have been recently added, and what is the definition of a wetland according to the Ramsar Convention, and what all comes under the definition of a wetland. Will a river, a lake also come under the wetlands? So what all will come under the definition of wetlands? Then what is the role that they play? So whether for instance the role that they play in absorbing the toxins or in changing the microclimate, so whatever the role that they play, so that role. And then what is Montreux's record, and which of the wetlands are there under this and why. So these are the important things that you'll have to cover under the topic of wetlands. So on this note, I also want to tell you one more thing, that if you look at the topics that I have been giving under the theme of the day prelims, first day I gave about Buddhism and Jainism, and then about the ocean currents, and today is the third day. And I have gone through the answers that you've been writing in the comment section. You must realize first of all the importance of this thing. So when I went through Shalaba's answer today, the way she has written is very beautiful. So it's one thing if there is a question that is asked even in the mains, so what are ocean currents, and what impact do they have on the economic activities and the environment. So this is a very probable question that can appear even in the mains examination. She and many others who have commented, they have not just prepared for the prelims, but they have also prepared their mains content and revised the ocean currents topic. Honestly, when I saw her answer, I felt that apart from a diagram or two, the topic of ocean currents is completely covered. And also it's very important to look at the way you present it. So if you go through that write up what she has written in the comment section, you see that even when she is talking about the reasons for the formation of the ocean currents, so she has categorized that into some primary factors and then secondary factors. So what we might be thinking is, okay, I already know the reasons for the formation of ocean currents, I can list them down as 1, 2, 3, 4. But then if you actually revise and write it, so then you will come out with such presentations as well about the primary factors and the secondary factors. And even when categorizing the ocean currents, she has done it based on the depth and based on the temperature, which again is very good. And this is exactly the kind of presentation that I keep talking about, which you'll have to write in your mains answers. So now apart from a diagram, her mains topic, ocean currents topic for even the mains GS1 syllabus is also now prepared. So what I urge you all to do is to not just think that this is a topic and I already know about this, and given a question I will be able to attempt this through elimination or some trick. I know the major currents which are there, I know on which coast of the continent it is there. But when you are given the same thing to be written for 15 marks or 10 marks in 7 minutes or 9 minutes, then that's a different game altogether. So when you are practicing, do it when you are writing it in the comment section. You are not just revising for your prelims, but you are also preparing that entire topic for mains. So the kind of questions we have practiced since April till recently are more related to general studies paper 2 and paper 3, because they are all related to current affairs. So you can use this as an opportunity to cover not just the prelims topics, revise them, but apart from that, these geography based questions, they are direct questions that are being asked in the mains exam. So you can cover them from the mains perspective as well, because you are revising them now either way for prelims. At least cover those topics which I am asking you to write in the theme of the day. So similarly for wetlands also, you may have a question on wetlands, that the challenges which the wetlands are facing, or the role that they have, the importance of the wetlands in the ecosystem. So all of these you will definitely prepare by thinking about them and writing from the prelims perspective as well. You will be preparing even from your mains perspective. So do take this seriously and revise and write your answers in the comment section. That will really help you. So with this, we will start with the topics of the day. So we will start with the first topic of the day, which is related to contempt of court. So this is a topic under your GS syllabus too. Whenever you're talking about judiciary, and under the issues of judiciary also, you may face one issue could be the contempt of court, which the courts are invoking these days too frequently. And it can also be an a question by itself related to what is contempt of court, what are the types of contempt, and is there a need to revisit the contempt law in India. So this could be a full-fledged question in itself. So now we'll discuss the recent news that was in the news was the Prashant Bhushan case. So Prashant Bhushan is a lawyer and a social activist, and he had tweeted twice in the last 1 month. So one of the tweet was about the recent Chief Justice of India, the current one, that is Justice Bobde, and the second tweet was about the 4 other Chief Justices of India in the previous terms. So now presently the Supreme Court has taken suo motu notice of these 2 tweets by Prashant Bhushan and has also started contempt of court proceedings against Prashant Bhushan. So when we talk of contempt of court, there are basically 2 main types of contempt. One is a civil contempt and the other is the criminal contempt. Civil contempt is whenever somebody is willfully shows that willful disobedience to a court order or a judgment. So civil contempt is about the willful disobedience or a willful breach of any undertaking that has been given to a court. Whereas a criminal contempt, it talks about any word that is either written in the written form or in the spoken form if it scandalizes or lowers the authority of the court. So this is one reason under the criminal contempt, that it either scandalizes or lowers the authority of the court. Second, that it interferes in the administration of justice. And third, that it interferes in the course of judicial proceeding. So first, it scandalizes or lowers the authority of the court. Second, it interferes in the judicial proceeding. And third, it interferes in the administration of justice. So these 3 are the grounds under the criminal contempt. So we will be discussing about the Constitution. Articles 129 and 215 of the Constitution empowers the Supreme Court and the High Court to punish the people for respective contempts. So the Constitution also has provisions for the same, and even the legislative framework is provided by the Contempts of Court Act of 1971. So now in this context, that is the context of the recent Prashant Bhushan case, we are going to see what is the requirement of a contempt law and whether we should with it now. So first is why contempt powers are required by the court. First is the courts give several judgments and orders, and it's very important to see that these judgments are implemented or rather enforced. So if the courts didn't have the contempt power, it would keep on passing orders and it may not get enforced or implemented. So therefore, in order to ensure that the court's orders and judgments are implemented or enforced, the contempt powers is very much essential. Second is the independence. So these contempt power is also going to sustain the independence of the Indian judiciary. So if they do not have the contempt powers, then it is very difficult to ensure the independence of the judiciary, and again, without the powers to ensure that their orders are implemented, rule of law will then again will be breached rather. So third is a public confidence. So it's very important to ensure that the public confides in the judiciary, that the judiciary is going to provide justice to the citizens. So that dignity of the judiciary in the eyes of the public should be there. And for this, contempt powers for the judiciary is very important, because whoever criticizes the judiciary, hurls such remarks against the judiciary, then the judiciary should be empowered to take some steps against it, so that the public confidence in the judiciary is going to bring justice to people, that should remain. So these are the reasons why we must retain the contempt powers of the judiciary. So next we are going to see why is it important for us to now pause and think about the relevance of these contempt powers in the current democratic scenario. So first is now is the era of social media. So in social media, there are always people who will start commenting, who keep observing what somebody is doing, and they criticize each and everything. So social media has given that unrestrained freedom of expression to people, where they have started to criticize and comment upon everything. So in such a case, the higher judiciary, should it actually expend its time, should it waste its time and energy in invoking the contempt powers for such criticisms which are heard over social media, which is absolutely no restrictions for people to comment upon the social media. So this is the era of social media, and should the judiciary actually waste its time and energy to look into these comments and then respond to it? Second is the need for accountability. Now, several times many people have criticized the Indian judiciary, but there have hardly been any such time where there is a criticism against the judiciary, and the judiciary has started with a transparent probe into it, and then some kind of investigation has happened, and that charge or that criticism has been proved wrong. This has never happened. Whenever anybody has criticized the Indian judiciary, more often than not there is contempt or some of the other thing, but there is hardly any probe that goes into it. So even when corruption charges are hurled against the judges or whatever it be, so there is hardly any transparent probe into those charges, but rather the court tries to silence the criticism by invoking its contempt powers. So what is needed more now is the accountability on part of the Indian judiciary rather than just invoking the contempt powers. So whenever any criticism is made to the judiciary, it needs to have a transparent investigation or a probe into it, and then prove that these criticisms were actually false. So this accountability is needed more now to ensure that the public have confidence in the Indian judiciary. The next reason is the constitutional cases. So the Indian judiciary already has so many constitutional cases which are pending in the court which requires the judicial attention. Whether it is the constitutionality of the Citizenship Amendment Act, or whether it is a matter of the electoral bonds or the habeas corpus petitions from Jammu and Kashmir, all of these are pending in the courts, and these are the constitutional cases where it involves the interpretation of the constitution, and that is one of the most important duties of the Supreme Court. So rather than considering these constitutional cases, why should the court spend or waste its time and energy in invoking contempt proceedings against these tweets? So that is one argument, that when so many constitutional cases are pending, the pendency is so high in the Supreme Court and the High Court, then why is it required for the higher judiciary to encourage or to invoke such to suo motu invoke contempt proceedings against such tweets or comments? Next is the fact that these contempt powers have a monarchical origin. So they originated in England when the King of England was himself delivering the judgments, and they had the principle was that the king can do no wrong. So therefore nobody should question what the judgments the king was actually passing. So in this case, even in fact in 2012 UK Law Commission, it made a recommendation to abolish the law of contempt by saying that the original intent of this law of contempt was to maintain a blaze of glory around the courts. So the Law Commission said that the original intention of the contempt provision was to maintain a blaze of glory around the courts, but that is no longer required. So therefore the UK Law Commission also in 2012 recommended that this contempt provision should be abolished. So this had a monarchical origin where the situation, the circumstances were very, very different compared to the democratic setting now. So now such type of contempt provisions do not find any place in the democratic setting which is present now. The next issue is the wide definition. So the contempt provisions have a wide definition. For example, it says that scandalizing the authority or lowering the authority of the court. So this has a very wide and wide definition, and anything can fall under this definition. So because of this, any criticism against the judiciary could also end up attracting the contempt provision, and thereby it actually has a long lasting effect on the liberties of the people to express. So their fundamental right to expression could also be hurt because of this wide definition that has been given to the criminal contempt. In this context, even Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer had commented that this law of contempt in India is having vague and wandering jurisdiction. So he says that the contempt law is having vague and wandering jurisdictions, and also its boundaries are uncertain. So therefore there is a tendency that these boundaries are often crossed, and that may end up trampling the civil liberties of the people. So that is what Krishna Iyer said, that the contempt provisions are vague and they have a vague and wandering jurisdictions and they have uncertain boundaries. So this is another reason why we should revisit our contempt provisions. Next is the democratic ethos. So our democratic ethos, our constitution grants freedom of expression under Article 19. So definitely the law of contempt, the provision of contempt does not seem to be in sync with these democratic ethos that is at the heart of the constitution. So therefore this is another reason we should revisit. Next is enforced silence. So this is also told by Justice A.P. Shah, who has written one of the articles on this contempt provisions. So A.P. Shah has been the Chief Justice of the Madras High Court and even Delhi High Courts, and he was also the former chairperson of the Law Commission. So you can quote the name of A.P. Shah and write some of the recommendations or some of the observations. So he says that this is actually leading to enforced silence. That is, whenever somebody is criticizing the judiciary and if the court ends up invoking the contempt provisions, then this kind of has a chilling effect on the freedom of speech. So in such case, the courts are actually enforcing silence on part of the citizens, that no citizen should actually criticize the judiciary. So whenever courts start invoking such provisions of contempt, then there is a doubt or there is a suspicion among the people that why is court responding to these criticisms by invoking the provisions? Has the court really done something wrong? So this enforced silence is actually giving rise to more suspicion in the minds of the people. So therefore there is more suspicion, more resentment, and for this enforced silence through invoking the contempt provision. So these are the various reasons why we should have a relook at our contempt provisions and laws. So let's look at the international scenario. In the international scenario in Canada, whenever the provisions of contempt needs to be invoked, it has to pass through a test, and this test is based on the fact that the contempt should be real, it must be substantial, and it must lead to immediate dangers to the administration of justice. So the test says that the contempt should be real, substantial, and immediate dangers to the administration of justice should be there. Only then contempt provisions can be invoked in Canada. In American courts also, the courts do not respond to such criticisms or comments on the judges that are usually made by the people. So they are not responded in the American courts with the contempt provision. So whenever there are any comments on the judges or the legal matters, that is not responded to by the courts by invoking the contempt provision. Even in the case of England, it is the same, that in 2013, this law on contempt has been abolished even in England. So this is the international scenario, and you can quote one or two of these examples to show that the international scenario is also fast changing, and this also can be another reason why we should relook at our provisions. So what is the way forward in this case? The way forward is to revisit the test for contempt. Just like what Canada has done, it's very important to ensure that this test is very precise and is not vague. So whenever we say that it scandalizes the authority of the court, it is a very vague, and as Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer has said, that it has vague and wandering jurisdictions and it has uncertain boundaries. So this test must be more precise, like what Canada has done, that it must pose immediate danger to the administration of justice. So like that, we have to refine our test so that whenever any criticism is done, the question that should be asked is whether this comment or whether this criticism, is it actually obstructing the court from its functioning. So only in such matters the contempt should be invoked, and in rest of the matters the criticism is best ignored by the judiciary. So this is a way forward. Now we'll go on to the next topic. Now we'll again be talking about the role of the governor. So in this case, we'll be talking about the role that is played by the Rajasthan governor, and also the role played by the Madhya Pradesh governor. So this again is part of your GS2 syllabus about the constitutional functionaries and the role of the governor. In the previous classes also we have seen several times the role of governor, and we have also recently revised the governor entire syllabus with the help of the 5 points under 5 issues. So now what we'll be looking at is a new development that has happened, and how the governors have been playing a very biased role in the functioning of the state. So in this case, it is about the developments that are taking place in Rajasthan. So the Congress government is in power, but some of the MLAs of the Congress government, including Sachin Pilot, they had started to rebel against their own party. So in this case, what the governor of Rajasthan, Kalraj Mishra, has been saying is that it's not possible to hold the trust vote now. So when the Congress government had these rebel MLAs, the Congress party, the chief minister who belongs to the Congress party, that is Ashok Gehlot, he asked the governor to convene the house so that a floor test could be conducted, and so that he can prove his majority in the house. But however, the governor Kalraj Mishra is saying that he has given some 6 reasons, and he has explained why is it not possible to convene the session now. So thereby, by doing so, he is trying to postpone the session of the assembly so that the chief minister is unable to prove his majority in the house. So this has been the role that is being played by the Rajasthan governor. So we have seen that under Article 163, the governor is given a lot of discretionary powers in the constitution. Article 163 says that the governor has to exercise his powers under the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, except in those areas where the governor has to exercise his own discretionary powers. But however, the courts have agreed or held in the past, the Supreme Court has settled this matter that the governor's power to convene the session of a legislative assembly, that doesn't come under the discretionary power. So the governor has to act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So here the chief minister is requesting the governor to convene the session, which means the governor has to abide by this aid and advice and convene the session. But in this case, the governor is not doing the same. So this shows how the governor is maybe acting under the pressure from the center and is also misusing his discretionary powers. So this shows, and what should be the way forward actually is that the governor has to convene the session, and also the democratic processes which have to happen, that is a floor test, must be conducted properly. This again parallel is drawn with the example of the Madhya Pradesh governor Lalji Tandon, and what role he played in bringing down the Congress-led government under Kamal Nath in Madhya Pradesh. So here what happened is the Kamal Nath government of Madhya Pradesh, it was saying that it is not possible to go for a vote of confidence, or rather the floor test, because some of the Congress MLAs have been in captivity. So therefore it will not be possible for them to turn up in the vote in the floor test. So therefore it is not possible for the floor test to be conducted immediately. But the governor Lalji Tandon held that whatever be the reason or whatever be the case, if the floor test is not conducted immediately, and if the government doesn't prove its majority immediately, then it will be presumed that the government has lost its majority in the legislative assembly. So here again we see that there was a genuine concern of the chief minister that some of the MLAs have been in captivity and they won't be able to turn up for the floor test, but still the governor was insisting that the floor test has to be done, otherwise it will be presumed that the government has lost its majority. So this is another example where the governor has played though an opposite role compared to Rajasthan, but however the role here again played by the governor shows the biased nature of his functioning, where he may be under the influence of the center, and therefore he has not acted according to the principles of constitution. So whatever it is, the governor has to ensure that the test of constitutional morality needs to be passed by the governor. So whenever any discretionary power also is being exercised by the governor, he has to make sure that this exercise of discretionary powers is in sync with the constitutional morality and the constitutional principles. So this is very important. So this shows two examples of the functioning of the governor. So you can quote them under the negative examples of the governor's functioning whenever a question is asked on the role of governor. We'll move to the next topic, which is revolution in policy mindset. So this editorial was talking about the fact that this SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, were there, which the countries across the globe had to achieve. But because of the pandemic and the economic slowdown that is happening in various countries because of the pandemic, they have lost that sort of direction which is needed to attain these Sustainable Development Goals. But however, there is also a lot of awareness in the countries which has been because of this pandemic, that the growth or the development has to be more sustainable, and they have through this pandemic understood and realized the importance of sustainable development more than before. So this can be part of your GS2 syllabus regarding the governance post pandemic. So what the editorial talks about is that there is now a revolution in the policy mindset. So earlier what was more important was the economic development, but now countries have started to see that if the sustainable development doesn't happen, then such pandemics could increase in their frequency in the future. So therefore there is kind of a revolution in the policy mindset where the importance is has to be given on four things. One is the governance systems. These governance systems must be more inclusive, and they must also be more accountable to the people. So inclusive and accountable governance systems is one thing that needs to be ensured. Second is the institutions. These institutions must be more adaptive because situations or the challenges are also continuously evolving. So the institutions need to be adaptive, and also they need to be resilient to the future shocks. So we need governance systems which are inclusive and accountable. We need institutions that are adaptive and that can that also show resilience to the future shocks. And third is the social protection. The pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of several sections of the society, and therefore it is very important to ensure that social protection and health insurance is given to all sections of the people. So this is one important thing. And then is a stronger digital infrastructure that is needed for that rapid transformation of these countries to cover up the loss during the pandemic. So all these are the four critical elements based on which the governance in the post-pandemic era is going to be based. So these are like the four pillars on which the governance is going to be based in the post-COVID world. So in this, the editorial also talks of an important international example, which is the South Korea's New Deal. So South Korea has now announced a new deal that is based on two Ds. One is digitization and the other is decarbonization. So these will be the two pillars in the growth or in the new deal of South Korea going forward. And so this article mentions about blue recovery and green recovery. The pandemic has led to economic slowdown in several countries, and these countries are now looking for economic recovery in the future in a post-pandemic world. But however, there is a recognition that this recovery has to be green or blue recovery. So blue recovery is for particularly countries in the Pacific. So they are looking for blue recovery, wherein they want to seize the opportunity to promote more sustainable fisheries practices, marine resource management. So blue recovery is related to more sustainable use of the ocean resources. And of course, countries like India are also aiming at green recovery. So recently we saw how India inaugurated this solar power plant in Rewa. And even China, for that matter, is creating more jobs in the renewable energy sector than it is doing in the fossil fuel sector. So green recovery and blue recovery are the important keywords which you can use in your answers whenever it is talking about the governance in the post-COVID world or related to sustainable development. These are the keywords which you have to use in your answers. So nothing more was there in this article. Next is about Dadabhai Naoroji. So this whole article was on Dadabhai Naoroji and what his views were. This is part of your GS1 syllabus about the important leaders of the Indian national movement and the contribution they have made. So this will come under that topic. So first, the article begins by saying that there are many firsts that are associated with Dadabhai Naoroji. He was a first modern economic thinker, He was the first Indian to get elected to the British Parliament, and he was also the first leader who established Swaraj as the goal of the Congress. So this whole thing gives a very brief but also very comprehensive introduction about who Dadabhai Naoroji was. So whenever you have a question on Dadabhai Naoroji and also his contribution, you can use this as an introduction to your answer, saying that Dadabhai Naoroji was an Indian first, and he was also the first modern Indian economic thinker, first Indian to get elected to the British Parliament, and also the first leader to establish Swaraj as the goal of the Congress. So this can be a good introduction to your answer. So next is Dadabhai Naoroji was a person who always felt that everybody is one. There is unity in diversity. He said that whether I am a Hindu, whether I am a Mohammedan, a Parsi, a Christian, or any other creed, above all that I am an Indian. So this is what he said. And he told that our country is India, our nationality is Indian. So basically what he feels is that in spite of so much of diversity, whether being a Hindu or a Christian or a Parsi or a Muslim, at the end of the day, like above all this, we are Indian. So he always had this Indian the ideology that he was an Indian first, and later on comes the rest of the things. So therefore he believed that everybody was one, everybody were Indian. So this was his core thought. Second is he was also a person who always felt that the growth has to be inclusive, the development has to be inclusive. So he said that India worked best when it worked together. So everybody will have to be together in India's progress, and everybody will have to develop and progress together. No section of the population should be left behind. There should be inclusiveness when we talk of development and growth. So that is why whenever participation of the minorities was involved, that issue was involved, he was always very proactive in such issues. The fact that he himself was a Parsi, which was a minority community, he personally himself knew what are all the issues that a minority community can face, and that made him all the more sensitive to the concerns of the minorities, and more is the urge that he felt that everybody should be part of the development story. So next is you may have a question like analyze the contribution of Dadabhai Naoroji, or critically analyze the contribution of Dadabhai Naoroji in the Indian national movement. So in this case you will definitely have to analyze, tell some limitations about Dadabhai Naoroji. So one is that he was not very much concerned about untouchability. The article even goes to the extent of saying that Dadabhai Naoroji was almost completely blind to the issue of untouchability. So when he was talking about poverty so much and backwardness of India, poverty of India, the fact that he missed out completely this issue of untouchability is quite glaring. So this is what the article says. Second thing is, while he endorsed Swadeshi, but then he hesitated to adopt tactics like boycotts and strikes, because he felt that these are unconstitutional methods. So therefore his support to those struggles which involved boycotts and strikes was not wholehearted, because though he believed that Swadeshi needs to be endorsed, he did not believe in these he did not believe in these methods because he thought that they were unconstitutional. So these could be written as part of your critical analyze portion of the answer. So next we will quickly look at the summary of his contribution. So first is, he is known as the Grand Old Man of India, and whenever you are talking about his contribution, he stayed in London for a couple of years, for many years, and then he came back to India. So you can draw this timeline kind of a representation and show his major contributions in London and his major contributions in India. So that can give your answer a more interesting and unique representation. So while he was in London, he founded the East Indian Association in the year 1866, and the purpose of finding this association was to propagate among the Britishers, in the British Parliament and also the British public. He wanted to propagate the cause of India. So this was the purpose of starting the East Indian Association. Second, he was also one of the founding members of the Indian National Congress along with Evo Hume and Dinshaw Vacha. So he was also one of the founding members. Then he was the critic of the economic policies of the British. So he called it economic imperialism and how the economic policies of the British were actually draining India of her wealth. So he wrote a book called as Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, where he clearly expressed the kind of economic exploitation that the British rule was doing in India. So he came out with the drain of wealth theory. So in this he explained how the drain of India's wealth to Britain is taking place. So how the British was transferring the wealth from India to Britain, and that was leading to widespread poverty in India. So all of this was told in the drain of wealth theory. Then he also made other demands. For instance, he told that the Indianization of the civil services should be there. The Indian civil service was that time British dominated, so he was demanding that the Indian civil service should be more Indian. So there has to be more Indian intake into the civil service. Then he demanded other things like there must be separation of the executive and the judiciary should be separate, and more Indian representation should be there in the House of Commons also in England. So all of these other demands were also made by Dadabhai Naoroji. Then through the drain of wealth theory and through the poverty and un-British rule, he also worked on the poverty in India. So the poverty line estimation was also given by during that time. So, and then he was a president of the Indian National Congress for 3 times in 1886, in 1893 and also in 1906. And it was in the 1906 session of the Indian National Congress that the goal of Swaraj was adopted. So during that time, Dadabhai Naoroji was the president of the Congress, and it was under his presidentship that the Congress declared that the goal was the Swaraj. So this was also another important milestone, that Swaraj is nothing but self-government. So through the Congress, he also held that Swaraj was the goal for the country. So this is a summary of the various contributions that Dadabhai Naoroji has made in the Indian national movement. So these were the other articles that were not important from your exam point of view. So today's question is what is Yuva? So do write in the comment section what you know about Yuva. So that's it for today. Thank you.